So we're here to talk about Smart Date, module that I made for making Drupal better at handling dates and times. My name is Martin Anderson-Clutz. I'm a solutions architect at Digital Echidna, and on Drupal.org and various other social platforms, I go by Manflu. So here's a usage chart. As you can see, it seems to have gathered some, let's say, community enthusiasm. Definitely feel like there's been a lot of great discussion in the issue queues, gotten some great support from the community, but we'll talk about that as we go on. Wanted to do something a little different with today's session. So I've given similar talks at a couple of other camps, and you know, I feel like the demo down to a pretty good science. But after the last session that I did, it occurred to me that I definitely needed to make sure I do a clean install of Drupal before I get ready to do a demo. And I thought, well, what if I actually started from a clean Drupal install, and then during the session, I can install this Smart Date calendar kit and then basically show you things that you're going to get essentially out of the box. So we're basically going to set up Smart Date in real time, and then I'll show you what that process looks like. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll get a sense of the powerful features that you can get and how quickly those can be added. So it was a fresh Drupal 9 install. I did add a couple of modules just because I like my Drupal to look pretty. So Olivero is the front end theme, and I use Gin and Gin Toolbar to make the admin side a little prettier. But that's really it. Admin Toolbar, because I find that makes Drupal a lot easier to work with. And then, you know, beyond that, it's really going to be just what we install in real time with Smart Date. So let's start the demo here. Here's the Drupal 9 site. If we go up, we can see that we've only got the default article and basic page content types. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of confidence that this is in fact just a very plain and basic install of Drupal. So I thought I would include here, these are the actual commands that I use to install this. So 8 command line commands here. As long as you've got Composer installed, you can do these. And I guess the only step I didn't include in here is adding it to your vhost file. But essentially, in terms of when I sort of reset this environment, I can do these 8 commands, and I end up with my my Drupal install that we just looked at. And then what we're going to add to that are these 2 here. So let's flip over to actually, escape out of here, and let's go to here, and we're going to go Composer. So let's require Drupal Smart Date calendar kit. So we'll talk a little bit more in detail around what the kit concepts are with Drupal, but for now, know that it's sort of a pre-built event system that we're going to install. And this can take a couple minutes, so I thought that's why I wanted to do this step early, and we'll come back and install that later on. So let's go back into our presentation. So now let's talk a little bit around the history of Smart Dates and what gave me the idea to create this module. So originally I got the idea, I was working on a website for a local fall fair and populating a fair bit of event data. It was set up in, I would say, a fairly conventional Drupal 7 way. So I had start and end date fields, and then I would format those. But as I was populating content for the site, I realized that it was actually extremely tedious to populate these, because if you look at these, for each of the start and end dates, you've got year, month, date, hour, minute, seconds, and then AM and PM that you have to populate manually. And so that's 14 pieces of data that you have to put in there. Whereas if you compare that experience to using sort of standard calendar application software that people would be used to, so Apple Calendar, Google Calendar, Microsoft Outlook, some of those, they definitely make the process much more painless by building some intelligence into the system. So for starters, they do a default time that's not now, which will fall on some weird minutes. So in this case, it would be 5:07 p.m., but you're almost never really going to want to schedule an event for 5:07 p.m. either now or 3:07 tomorrow afternoon. It's usually going to be on the hour. So rounding that off makes life easier for editors, and then also having this concept of a duration. So you can see in both of these examples, it's got a duration defaulted to an hour, but you can adjust those. And what that means is starting with a default value of starting at the next hour and lasting for an hour. As somebody going in to put in an event, say you just got off the phone and you want to set up a follow-up meeting for sometime next week, there may only be 2 or 3 pieces of data that you need to adjust in these, and then your event is basically ready to save. And again, compare that to our other example of having to manually populate 14 pieces of data. And then the other thing that you'll notice that's actually common to both of these is having the all-day checkbox. And again, because the people actually using the websites that we build in Drupal are used to having these kinds of conveniences available, they expect to see those in Drupal. And at the time that I started, I would say coalescing the thinking around Smart Date, I was working on a site where we ended up implementing this as kind of a separate field and then wiring it back to the other fields using some JavaScript. But the consequences of doing that as its own custom field is that the views around that ended up being really, really complex to build. And then the other thing that we often were having clients ask about was more natural formatting in terms of how Drupal would output times and dates. So instead of outputting something, let's say, Thursday, September 17th, 4 p.m. to Thursday, September 17th, 5 p.m., more naturally in language, we'd say Thursday, September 17th, 4 to 5 p.m. So there's a lot of sort of redundant data that we're taking out of there to make it easier to parse. And so ideally, from a formatting standpoint, we'd be able to sort of, again, get that more or less out of the box. And then the final piece is, again, as I was starting to put all of these pieces together, I was doing an audit on a site that was getting ready to launch. So I did a crawl, and I was surprised to see that the slowest page on the site by far was actually an events archive page. Almost no content there. Again, site about to launch, so not really any, not a lot of past events that had to be listed. So what I did was I enabled the debugging in views, and you can see that the query that it was using to generate that list was actually fairly horrendous. It was having to go through, because Drupal 8 has date fields, but by default it stores those as strings. To be able to do any kind of a comparison between the time now and the time that's stored for any particular date, it's having to do a number of different conversions to convert that into something that it can compare to the time now. And so those kinds of views end up being kind of sluggish. And so it's really the combination of that editor experience, trying to make that as sort of easy and intuitive as possible and aligned with, again, calendar apps that people are used to using every day, having the formatting that site visitors are going to want to see, and then also making sure that we could have, good performing views built on top of these really gave me the idea to create this module. And so let's talk about, the approach that I took in trying to build the module itself. Above all else, I really wanted to, as much as possible, really leverage some of the existing classes and methods in core. I mean, obviously there are, very talented and, knowledgeable developers who put a lot of work into all of the pieces that are already in Drupal core, definitely rigorously tested. And so to the extent that I could really leverage pieces that were in core already and maybe put them together in ways that core didn't already support, could allow me to provide a lot of this functionality without actually having to write a lot of code. And again, it's a testament to the object-oriented nature of Drupal 8. So Drupal 8 has this core date range field, and it has HTML5 datetime pickers. And so I was really able to extend off of that, use that as a starting point, and then just add to it. And in the same way, Drupal already stores a number of values as timestamps. And for anyone who's not familiar with timestamps, it's essentially storing any date and time as a number of seconds since the start of the Unix epoch, which is 1970. And so it's a, it looks like a big number, but it's essentially stored as an integer, so it's fairly performant. It's easy to make sort of comparisons in terms of, which one is bigger than the other. And Drupal core already stores a number of values as timestamps. So when you think about nodes, the date a node was created or the last date that a node was updated, those are both stored as timestamps. And the same thing with users in terms of the date a user was registered on the site versus the last time a user logged in, again, stored as timestamps. So lots of existing sort of storage classes and also methods to convert sort of to and from timestamps. In fact, if you're using core functionality for, let's say, formatting dates, oftentimes it's converting to timestamps in order to display those. So even if you sort of hear grumblings about maybe timestamps not being a great format because it has limitations, well, the truth is you're probably going to be constrained those even in just using core. One of the early requests that we had for Smart Date was really around being able to manage recurring dates. And obviously there's a good module already called Date Recur that is widely used in the community. So tried to see if Smart Date could work with that, but because of the way Date Recur sort of stores its date in a very custom way, there really wasn't a way to make those work together. And so I started thinking about, well, if I was going to implement recurring dates in Smart Date, is there a different approach we could take to, maybe make it easier, particularly for site builders? And so the way Date Recur works is if you have, let's say, your node and you attach a recurring event to it, it's actually directly attaching the sort of the concept of how it recurs, and then it has in a separate table all of the instances of when, let's say, a recurring meeting actually happens. And so to do something like display a list of upcoming meetings, you actually have to build the relationship across to where those actual instances are stored. And so I thought, well, for Smart Date, what if we took the reverse approach and we actually stored the instances as essentially field values, much like if you had, let's say, a multi-valued, Smart Date field, and then the recurrence parameters that could be stored as a separate element. And so taking that approach actually means that it's actually really easy to build, let's say, a view or an event calendar that has a mixture of, let's say, content types that have recurring dates and ones that don't. Because of the way they're all stored in a common way, it's really easy to sort of display all of those together. And still has an interface to be able to do things like override or cancel specific instances. So you get still a lot of control in terms of how to manage your recurring dates. And then also realize that because once you get into recurring dates, you might have, dozens, maybe hundreds of instances of a particular date. It would be better to have a formatter that could be smarter around how it displays those. So created a formatter specifically for recurring dates that allows you to show sort of a natural language output of how it recurs, and then you can configure how many sort of upcoming or previous instances it will display. And then the last sort of big initial request was really around calendar integration. Obviously, again, people using calendar apps are used to having that sort of very graphical way of both visualizing and managing their dates. And so had some discussion on that. Actually, it was someone in the issue queue who suggested full calendar view and found that it's actually very well maintained. And so originally had to create a patch for full calendar view to get it to work with Smart Date, but the maintainer of that module was actually able to create sort of a plugin class. And by implementing that within Smart Date now, without patching either module, those two work together. So out of the box now, you get drag and drop support. You can double click in a calendar to add a new event. And again, because of the way it's stored, you can display those recurring dates directly in your calendar without any sort of additional hassles or challenges. And so I had mentioned earlier about sort of the starter kit. We saw that's what we started by installing the Smart Date calendar kit, and it's really sort of a bundle of configuration and no real code per se. Just an attempt to sort of capture what I would consider a set of best practices in terms of how a simple event system might be set up. But the beauty of it is that once you install it, you can actually uninstall the module. It's not really doing anything afterwards. And then you have this event content type, you have some views associated with it, and you can continue to customize it and add sort of the quirks and features that make it suit the particular business needs of the site you're working on. Or it might be that you just want to try out Smart Date and quickly get it installed in a way that lets you try out some of the features. So either way, hopefully you find these useful. And by all means, if you have ideas of how these could be better configured, would be welcome any patches or even just opening up feature requests and what have you. So with that, let's go back to check our demo install and see how that's coming along. So that composer install has worked. And now let's just go ahead and use Drush to install it. Now you can see there's a number of modules that this one install will get installed for us, as well as the configuration for them. And now if we go back in and refresh our page, now we can go in and create an event. So here is our Smart Date interface. So as you can see, it definitely has some commonality. It's drawn a lot of inspiration from some of those other calendar apps. So if we do things like change the particular date, so let's change it to 10 p.m., you can see it automatically updates the end based on changes we've made to the start, based on the duration that we've selected, or you could go the other way and change the duration, and again, it'll update the end for you. You could also do things like change the end manually, and then it'll tell you that you're using a custom duration as opposed to one of the formats. Let's go ahead and just call this test event for now. I've got a couple of extra values, so let's see. Next one, let's go 10 a.m. Saturday, 8:30 p.m. until 12:30 a.m. The other thing you might have noticed is that our date has our all-day checkbox, and when you check that, it hides the other elements to basically keep things simple. And a couple more here. Again all day, and then one last one for now. So let's save that, and you can see that it's done some of those things that we talked about in terms of removing the duplicate elements in a time range. So where we've got the start and end on the same date, it'll only display it at the start, if that's how we configure it, but we'll get on to that. But if it rolls across days, then obviously it has to output both to make that clear. Some of the formatting in this case is probably going to be easier to see if we actually change a little bit how our event is displayed. So let's go over here and manage to display. You can see we've got some different formatters, but we'll come back to that later. And now let's change it to the default compact format. Let's save that and refresh. That gives you a clearer idea of sort of a lot of that deduplication that's happening, and the nice sort of clean presentation of some of those ranges that ideally much more closely approximates kind of natural language presentation of some of those time and date ranges. All right. So having talked about those formats, let's actually do one other thing, which is to go in here and look at our field configuration options. So you can see we have sort of these up here are the default Drupal date time default options, but we've added this custom one for smart date that's next hour, again, to sort of try and mimic what people are used to using in their everyday business calendar applications. And then we've got our list of elements here. We could do things like, let's go add 0 and none. This is sort of your standard pattern within Drupal of having a value and then an optional pipe separated label, text label that you can add on things. So these could just be numbers. If we wanted, they're also minute values. One other thing I'll mention is that we showed how that custom value works. If you were to actually remove that from your allowed duration increments, then it would effectively force people to use one of the specified duration values. So for example, if you were organizing a conference where all of the events, all of the sessions had to be either 45 or 90 minutes, you could set those as your only two values, delete the custom, and at that point, when you were editing your interface, actually the end value would be read-only, and you would only be able to update the start or switch between the duration values if there was more than one allowed. So it gives you a lot of control in terms of what your users are able to access. Let's go ahead and save that. And the other thing, since we had talked about the smart date formats, is let's talk about what those look like to be configured. So we go in here, we can edit one. You can see there's definitely some common elements with how the core date formats work, but where those use a single string, the smart date formats are actually much more granular, and that gives us the ability to use that intelligence in terms of how things are going to display. So actually here, let's go back a step here and add our own. So let's create a new one. Let's call this format. Create off. Actually, you know what? We're going to play with time zones later. Let's actually call this our time zone format. So we can leave those dates as is, but then we want to use something here that has our time zone reflected. And you can have a label for all day events, or if you want to keep it cleaner, you can just leave that out. With separators, again, you have the option. You could do something like have a text value in there, and similarly, how the date and time pieces are put together. You can do something simple like a comma, or the compact value use more of like a pipe separator. And then you have options between date and time. If the deduplication that we were talking about doesn't seem to be working well for you for your format, you can turn that off. And similarly, there's control over whether or not, when there's a time zone specified for an event, whether it'll actually also show it in the site time. So you have control over those elements as well. But we'll see a little bit more of that later on. So that's a look at our formats. Maybe that's a good time to actually go back and look at our, go a little bit deeper in terms of the time zone. So let's switch over to our widget, to the smart, sorry. The display, I want the form display. And let's say date and time range with time zone. So by switching to this, it'll look the same, but with an added time zone element. So you just specify a time zone for any date values. The other thing that it does, and this was actually from feedback that I got at a previous Drupal camp, so definitely always open to good suggestions. So let's go. You can specify a number of time zones if you don't need users to be able to choose from all of them. You can specify a particular set, and then it will present them with just those options. So let's go. Let's just pick a few here. Like those. And then if we go, actually, let's add a new event. We can see now that we've got our time zone with only those values that we said were going to be allowed. So again, if you have a site where you want to allow users to specify a time zone, but it doesn't need to be global in sort of, its reach, there's a way to sort of make that experience easier for your editors. So let's just check with our slide here. I think we're doing okay for time. Make sure that we covered all those. All right, we're doing great there. All right, so we talked about recurring events. So let's go ahead and switch to our command line, and we're just going to enable the submodule that SmartDate has for recurring events. So SmartDate recur, and then all that. And then what we need to do now, go back in here. We need to tell SmartDate that explicitly that we want this SmartDate field to allow recurring date values. So again, you can have a mixture of SmartDate fields that some allow recurring dates, but some don't. You have that option. There are also discrete permissions in terms of which roles can use those. You have the option of setting recurring events that don't have an end date. And if that's the case, you can tell SmartDate how far out to generate instances. So if I said I'm defining a weekly meeting, but it's going to go on indefinitely, you don't necessarily want it to generate instances out until the end of time, because that's going to sort of use up a lot of database and chew up a lot of memory and resources as it has to pull those into memory. So it only, you can tell it how far out you think is going to be useful for the sake of your site, and then it'll use a cron job to, on a rolling basis, make sure that it always has, in this case, 12 months of events further out to show. So otherwise, I think we can leave these values as they are. And the other thing that I'll show while we're here, let's switch back over to the display. And now we've got this recurring formatter. And as we talked about, we can set how many sort of past or upcoming instances we want it to show. So in this case, let's change it to show the most recent and the 3 next of any event that we're going to make recurring. So having saved that, let's go ahead and make a new event. Let's call this our recurring event. Let's set this back a ways, and then provides this, again, very simple UI to be able to specify these. So we can say we want this to end after a certain number of times. We can say we want it to end on a specific date. So let's say go until the end of the year. In this case, let's just say we want to make it go for 10 instances. And then you can do more complicated things. So we could say we want it to go, every other week. We could have it say we want it to be every week on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. We could do something like monthly on the 3rd Thursday, and similarly annually you could say annually on the 3rd Thursday, and because it's annual, it would grab the month from the start, so it would be annually on the 3rd Thursday of September. So it gives you a lot of control. I think at the last talk I gave, someone asked about doing something like the first Monday of a full week, which I gather is something that how a number of sort of statutory holidays are set. So There may be support coming up for date structured that way. I'm still trying to get my head around, I guess, particularly if that's only something you need for annual dates or potentially something that might be needed also for monthly dates. So if you have opinions on some of those issues, by all means, chime in. I'd love to hear any feedback on those kinds of issues. But in this case, let's just keep it weekly. And let's just keep it simple, actually, for our use case. So let's go ahead and save that. And then we can see our recurring event formatter. So weekly on Thursday at 6 p.m. 10 times. It shows our most recent, according to how we set it up, and then the 3 next ones. A couple of things that I'll mention while we're looking at this formatter. This is all defined in a twig template. So I used details elements for these because I think details elements are fun and cool. But if you don't think those are a good fit for your site, or you just would prefer something else, it's easy to override that twig template in your theme and change that completely into anything else. Also, typically the way SmartDate tries to return markup is in a render array. So even with the standard sort of date and time ranges that we saw before, those are really returned as render arrays as opposed to strings. And so if you wanted to manipulate those, let's say you have sites where they try and do the date and almost like it looks like a little page from a calendar. So you've got the number, or sorry, the month above the number, and sort of styled in a way. Those are all things you can manipulate via the render array before it goes to output. So hopefully those things, again, as sort of a site builder, give you a lot of capabilities and will make your life easier in terms of sort of making your clients happy and satisfied. So now that we've made our recurring date, let's check out our calendar. So let's go. If we don't have a menu yet, just put things up. Let's check out our event calendar. And you can see all of the events that we've created are in there now. As an administrator, I could say, well, this particular one is at 10 a.m., but let's just grab one and say, we're going to reschedule that one to Friday instead of Thursday. It'll pop up a confirmation. This is all configurable as part of the view. So if you want people to just be able to move things around and not have to answer to those kinds of confirmations, that's definitely something a change you can make yourself. And then you can also do things like reschedule it within a day, or even do things like change the actual duration. So again, lots of capabilities. And then if you want to create an event, you can double click and say, event, and that. You could make it recurring, all of those same capabilities. And then to go back, you can see there's a new event in there. So I think that's what I was meaning to cover in the demo part. If anybody has pieces that they want to see, by all means, drop those in the comments and we can try and get to those at the end. But seeing that we're starting to get down on time a little bit, I thought I would try and wrap up with some discussions around how the module has evolved over time and kind of where things are going next. Let's go back into our presentation. So some of the things that we encountered along the way, either feature requests or specific challenges. Originally, some of those SmartDate format pieces were actually direct pieces of configuration in the formatter itself. And actually, there's still I believe it's called now a custom formatter where you can do that instead of using a format. What I found, so actually, let me go back up. The reason I went to using the SmartDate format as a configuration entity type is that it makes them translatable. But in addition to that, it also means that they're easy to reuse. So if you have different content types where you want to have date fields, it's easy to keep those consistent using your SmartDate formats. And for example, you could have your views showing consistent formatting to your content types. And that's all really easy by leveraging those smart date formats. Definitely views and token support were pieces that we put some time into making sure we're well supported, and probably ongoing efforts there. As we saw, time zones per event is something that Core doesn't support, and so there's definitely interest in trying to get that into smart dates. And in the 3.0 branch, that's quite new this month. Just did the 3.03 release today. Smart date, you can use it with Core datetime and datetime range fields. So for datetime fields, you can only use the formatter, whereas datetime range fields, you can use the widget as well as the formatter with those. So if you have an existing site and you don't want to go through the work of getting everything converted over to smart date, but want to give, let's say, some of the editor UX improvements and some of the formatting improvements, there's definitely sort of a middle ground now for you to use those with Core. Definitely have had a lot of community help along the way. So very early on, someone had posted some code that they had used as part of a migration from a Drupal 7 site, Drupal 7 date field, to a Drupal 8 site using smart date. And so you can use that code as a starting point. There's been some help in terms of getting smart date to work well with Drupal 9. Some pieces around serialization, so particularly for being able to export content, including smart date information, into code, let's say, for moving between environments or other sort of similar uses. That's been coming along. A variety of smaller fixes, but especially the drag and drop editing in the calendar is definitely something that was really largely community driven and definitely hugely appreciated. There's been some work on trying to get views granularity, but it's really more of I would say, a Core issue. And so that's definitely something that we're hoping to get resolved, and ideally something that, again, because key parts of smart date are really leveraging Drupal core, we're hoping that by assisting with getting that fixed in Core, then that means it'll be fixed in smart date. So that's kind of the angle that we're trying to take there. Another feature request that is being strongly considered is around being able to set sort of minimum and maximum date values. So again, thinking of that conference example, if you had a conference that only was running for 3 days, to be able to set those days as your minimum and maximum values for the date would potentially be more intuitive. So that's definitely something we're looking at. Some kind of a solution that's simple to implement for registration. So looked at a number of different modules that potentially smart date could integrate with. So things like RNG, the BAT module, even the web form demo event registration potentially is something that could be leveraged to create some kind of a workable integration. So again, if you have ideas on this space, if there are approaches you've tried, I would love some feedback in terms of which way is maybe going to be, let's say, the simplest to implement, simplest for end users. Again, whatever feedback you have would be appreciated. There's also been some discussions around getting some elements of what smart date does directly into Drupal core, and obviously have done as much work as I have because I'm passionate around making Drupal better at managing events, and so if I can do more of those things out of the box, I think that would be just amazing. So to sum things up then, really tried to develop that editor experience that would be much better, much more like the applications that sort of content authors are used to using on a daily basis, and making Drupal as intuitive and work in similar ways. From a formatting standpoint, to make Drupal able to create that natural language translatable output. And then also from a performance standpoint, to be able to manage sometimes complex queries for dates and times in a way that isn't going to drag down your site, and do all those in a way that for site builders makes it easy to implement things like recurring dates, interactive calendars, and even time zones per event. So that's the material that I had prepared, but if there are questions, I would love to answer them. All right. Given all the functionality of Smart Date, is there anything that would make you choose the default Drupal functionality instead? Yeah, that's a good question. So let me just take a quick drink. The reality is that because Smart Date is a contrib module, and while I've been really excited to see the level of adoption that it's had, it's definitely not like, ubiquitous in terms of how many people use it. And so if there were other modules that you were relying on your date storage or date field to work with, and those didn't support Smart Date, then absolutely there's a use case where it would be better to, at least for storage, use like a date time range field, and then potentially use Smart Date as, let's say, if you wanted to augment the interface with something. So those are maybe some use cases. I'm sure there are other people. I know there were people I heard from who were excited about Smart Date, but not necessarily sold on the level of commitment of defining a field with a custom module. And so I think part of the reason I decided with the 3.0 branch to have it support core was so that people could try out at least the the interface and output aspects without necessarily what some might consider the risk of having your site architecture depend on a contrib module. So hopefully that answers your question. Thanks for the feedback, Adam. Any other questions? Curious to know if anybody actually did try and install a fresh Drupal 9 site on their local and follow along. If anybody did try and do that, please post that in the chat. Well, if there aren't any other questions, maybe let everybody out a little bit early. I can sort of stick around in case there are more questions. Just switch to the final slide here. Again, on Drupal.org, I'm Madhu. You can also find me as the owner of the Smart Date modules. And if you want to post feature requests in the issue queue, generally try to help out with support requests as well. Again, any feedback is definitely appreciated. Thanks, everyone.